Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. It's Friday, April 21st, and we have a lot of news to discuss this week. First, we'll take a look at an escalating civil war in Sudan, where two rival military factions are vying for power by bombing cities and attacking towns. Then, the growing challenge of an alternative bloc to the West, as China tries to pick off U.S. allies and big countries throughout the global South, like Brazil and South Africa, make clear they want a bigger voice. And finally, NATO, as defense ministers from 50 countries around the world are once again gathering in Germany to discuss how they can support Ukraine, we will take a look at how NATO is doing and what it is doing to enhance its own security in the face of a Russian military threat. Here to talk about these issues are Prashant Rao, senior editor of Semaphore. Great to see you, Prashant.
Thanks for having me.
Also with us, Carla Robbins, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Hi, Carla.
Hey, Ivo.
And Steve Erlanger, chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times, based in Brussels. Great to see you, Steve.
Likewise.
Prashant, let's start with you. The biggest real story is a pending civil war in Sudan. In fact, it's not pending, it's ongoing. I'm in Washington. I bumped into the UK ambassador yesterday, who said that the last week they've all been doing is trying to figure out how to get their people out. The U.S. is putting troops in Africa to try to get their people out. One problem, there's a war going on and there's no way in, and frankly, there's no way out. First of all, how did this war happen? Second, what do you think is going to happen next?
The second question is really easy to answer. I don't know. I'm not sure anyone does, because the characters at play are so it's such a personality-driven conflict in so many ways. It's not sort of structural forces that can be easily predicted. I think, if we were to talk about the proximate cause of this conflict, it would be that the Sudanese army tried to integrate the rapid support forces, the paramilitary force, into the army. But as with all of these things, you have to disaggregate between short-term and long-term. And so if that was the short-term cause, really this has been a long-running. We could possibly date it as far back to the time of Omar al-Bashir. He brought the RSF into the Sudanese security apparatus, but as with many dictators, didn't want to consolidate too much power in the armed forces, and so fragmented them. And so as a result, what you saw was a sort of security force that has, differing centers of power. And so this kind of tension that was brewing between the two heads of the armed forces and the RSF, it sort of bubbled up over and over again. And, they found tactical alliances, as with, in 2019 when they ousted Bashir, and then 2021 when they then ousted the civilian government. But the fact was, those tactical arrangements couldn't pick over these deeper differences and the deeper power struggle over who is actually in charge. And so, it doesn't look like this is the kind of thing that's easy to resolve. But at the same time, there are states that have some measure of influence over Sudan. Sudan, unfortunately, is going through just a disaster economically. And so, there are ways to incentivize, hopefully, some measure of pulling back. The timing of this conflict and the fact that, at the very least, the RSF has talked about a 72-hour ceasefire over Eid al-Fitr suggests that maybe there'll be a break. But yeah, the difficulty is, in so many ways, this is really about a conflict about two men. And their desire for power. And so it's very hard, to just say, oh, if, we just move the chess pieces in this way, everything will stop. I just don't think it will be that simple.
I think, Prashant, a conflict between two men, both of whom wanted what the other one wants as well, and neither of them can get it together because they tried that one. Steve, it seems to me it's one of those conflicts that you look at it and you just despair because there isn't much you can do. Clearly, yes, the Egyptians are supporting one side and the UAE and the Saudis are supporting the other side, but neither of them are capable of changing the military bounds, nor would anyone want to. And it's not clear that economic incentives is going to sway these guys. So what's the thinking? What do you hear in Brussels? I mean, there are, of course, embassies and personnel throughout. There's a large UN presence in Sudan. Not to mention the people who actually live there, who's suffering and can't get food and can't go outside. Is there a sense that we need to do something, but not knowing what, or is there a sense, no, actually, we need to figure out a way to find a way to end this war quicker?
It's a deeply depressing time when you think of that and what just happened in Yemen, too, when 80 people died trying to get food aid. It's quite an end to Ramadan, I have to say. It's just very sad. Here, the EU has had 2 of its diplomats attacked and shot in Sudan. I mean, it's been very, very difficult. This is the kind of thing you kind of want to say, where's the OAU, where's the African Union? I mean, where is the United Nations, right? I mean, is there any way the outside world can come and intervene? It doesn't feel like it. And yet, not very long ago, everyone was saying, oh, we're on our way to yet trying again to have a civilian government. So, one of them keeps saying, oh, yeah, I'm in favor of a civilian government, but only after I exterminate my rival. And I just think it's nobody knows what to do. That's for sure. Nobody wants to put troops there. I suspect people just want to see it burn itself out. Obviously, there are people trying to mediate. There are people trying to talk to both sides. Beginning with a ceasefire would be a great thing. But when I hear people in Khartoum talking about what it's like, in our paper, but also on the BBC, no one's very optimistic about it. I just think this is something that Europe can't seem to want to do much about, and maybe because of old worries about colonialism, doesn't think it should do much to settle. But I have more questions than I have answers, I have to say.
Yeah, it's early going, but Carla, one of the things that isn't early going yet is the second guessing. It's already happening in Washington. Why was it that we didn't evacuate our embassy personnel as soon as possible? Frankly, why was it? I believe the ambassador and deputy ambassador are not in country at this time, but I may be wrong about that. But sort of this idea, we should have anticipated this, and here we go again. We have people stuck in the middle of a war zone, and we have to figure out how to get them out. And frankly, we can't even sit in an airplane because the runways are all bombarded.
Yeah, the Germans and the Japanese tried to get planes in and then had to turn them around. And you don't just have, about 70 people in the U.S. Embassy. You've got an estimated 19,000 Americans there on the ground. And, so yes, there's a lot of second guessing, but there's also this big second guessing and debate inside of Washington that's been going on for months, which is, should we have put sanctions on these 2 leaders a lot earlier? Sanctions, of course, Holbrooke once said, sanctions are what you do between you declaring war and you just beating your chest. But there has been a big debate inside the Africa Bureau and higher up in the State Department about whether they should have been knocking these guys' heads a lot more aggressively a lot longer ago versus the Assistant Secretary of State, who was saying, no, we don't want to push too hard. We don't want to be too arrogant. We have a chance of negotiating something here. Obviously, any attempt to try to negotiate some sort of transition failed. But the second guessing is also on this question of whether we should have been pushing a lot harder, a lot more aggressively, a lot earlier.
Yeah, and that, sort of raises a larger question, Prashant, is how much influence do we have? It is, so you can say we should have been more engaged either on the diplomatic side or on the economic sanction side, but what influence would it have if, I think, as you said, Prashant, this is really a conflict between 2 guys who want to have what the other and want to have power and deny it to the other, even if that causes their death. Is this something that we could have done differently? Could we have solved this problem? Could we have addressed it? And then I'm not only talking about the U.S., I guess also the UN and as Steve said, the African Union.
I guess the difficulty with asking that question is assuming that the United States has unlimited attention, unlimited ability to resolve all of the world's problems. And also, I always worry that the underlying sensibility of that question is that the U.S. knows how to solve those problems if only it had the time and attention. And that's not to say that the U.S. is full of mistakes. The U.S. I think is certainly in good faith trying to do a lot of these things. I just mean to say that these actors have agency of their own, and even if the United States had tried, we shouldn't assume that if only the U.S. had paid more attention, this wouldn't have happened. This is, I think, sort of not true actually of most conflicts and most tension in the world. Is we see these actors will sometimes act in what they believe to be their own interests, and sanctions, economic packages, they don't provide the necessary incentives. Sometimes I think, particularly, we've all been, foreign correspondents have been around the world. One of the lessons I feel like I've learned from that is, the U.S. often thinks in tactics and strategy, and local actors think on a third level, which is existentialism. This idea that we're not playing in a chessboard here, because if I lose, then I'm gone. And so I just don't believe that, there is an incentive package that would have allowed both of these actors to believe that they have fulfilled their interests. You were just saying, Ivo, that they both think they can win. And so what exactly is the solution to allowing them both? I just don't think that they think there is a system in which they could both survive.
Yeah, I think that's a smart point, Prashant. Sort of there is this American tendency that we can solve everything, and if only we pay attention or have the right strategy, we could have done it. And it probably, in this case, it isn't. Maybe that explains, and it's sort of maybe a good segue, Carla, why the Chinese decided not to get involved, because they are trying to build peace, and they did, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. In some ways, they're trying to at least rhetorically do it in Ukraine, rhetorically. But more importantly, I think this week we saw something interesting. We saw Brazilian President Lula going to Beijing and basically spouting the Beijing line of creating a peace bloc, and frankly, against the West, by having the same line on the Ukraine war. It's the West's fault, arguing for the end to the dollar as the reserve currency. You have this emergence of this new sort of counter-Western bloc. And Carla, sort of, how deep do you think this is? How real do you think it is? Is it tactical? Is it strategic? Is it likely to fundamentally alter how politics in the world is going around? Or is this part of the general fragmentation that we've been seeing around the world? How do you look at it when you see a Lula, when you see Lavrov going to Brazil and South Africa, and China being as activist as it has been?
Well, certainly that's what she wants, and the Russians are desperate for it. I think the Russians and the Chinese have a very different view of these things. Lavrov was in Brazilian. He was absolutely chortling when Lula made his comments. But she, there's a bigger game here for Xi. And he, when he talks about peace, I mean, it seems really cynical, but Lula bought into it. And the same way, to a certain extent, Macron bought into it when it came to Taiwan. And so I think there's a warning in this for us, the same way there was a warning in those 30, countries that abstained at the UN, General Assembly on the vote of Ukraine. I mean, this is all this notion of multipolarity. I think there's a real warning in this here that the world that we see is so simple. This is a fight in Ukraine for rules, that the rest of the world sees, lots of different fights going on and with lots of different questions. Lula, I think it's worth looking at Lula in part. Reuters right now is reporting that Lula's going back to Europe. He's going to go to Portugal and Spain, and he's not going to kick the U.S. and Europe in the teeth because he thinks perhaps he's gone too far. That if he wants to be a peacemaker, which has as much to do with his own personal ambition and with Brazil's ambition, they've been pissed off for a really long time that they're not part of the Security Council. And that he's supposedly going to tone it down. When Lula came in, first of all, the Biden administration was so thrilled that he wasn't Bolsonaro, the Trump of the tropics. Biden thought that he was going to, Biden people thought they were going to be natural allies on things like climate. But, Lula's a leftist, he's a labor leader, and he's really sort of tempted by this notion. And he also got very strong economic interests with the Chinese major trading partner. So there are a lot of reasons why he wanted to do this. But I think it's quite interesting that what we're seeing from the reporting right now out of Brasilia is that if he really does think he can be a peacemaker, maybe being totally in the Chinese camp is not the right idea. Now, do I believe he can be a peacemaker? No, I don't believe he can be a peacemaker. But I think the ambition of Lula and the fact that so many other countries don't see this as just a right and wrong camp, I think there's an important warning in there.
That Nobel Prize keeps sitting out there for world leaders, and very few get it before they even started being their presidency. Sorry. President Obama.
Who are you talking about, Ivo?
Yeah, exactly. Steve, interesting. So I wonder how Europeans were covering this trip, and actually Lavrov's trip a couple of weeks ago through Africa and then to South Africa, where he was also embraced by the government there. And now in Brazil, where he seems to be embraced, but this is there this sense that we are falling into two blocks, and not? I mean, clearly that was Macron's idea, but that we're losing people who should be on our side.
It's very funny to hear some nostalgia for Bolsonaro, I have to say. It's pretty funny, right? I mean, you have to look at the world and laugh sometimes. Look, China has a role to play. I mean, let's not forget that. I mean, if anyone is capable of restraining Vladimir Putin, it's Xi Jinping. It's not Lula, it's not Macron, it's not Joe Biden, it's Xi Jinping. And I think Xi Jinping is doing something to that effect now. So the idea of going to talk to Xi about Ukraine is hardly a stupid idea. I mean, you just have to go with the right expectations or go with low expectations. But if you can't talk to China about Ukraine, who else is there to talk to? Erdogan? I mean, seriously, because there has to be some form of conclusion to this war, not soon. We'll have to see what happens during this famous, infamous, much publicized, advertised counteroffensive. We'll have to see where we end up there. But I think sometimes, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate Washington's paranoia, but, to pretend that anyone who talks to Xi is somehow not on our side is, I think, a very narrow and foolish way of looking at the world. Everybody's got lots of different interests, and Europe has an interest in the war ending, I have to say, and Europe has an interest in restraining Putin. And I was thinking with Sudan, the parallel to Ukraine is very, very real. You still have two sides who think they're going to win, and until one of them understands that's about as far as they're going to get, there's not much more we can do. Now, in terms of, where the world is, I mean, it's been a polyvalent world for a long time.
Steve, right? Let me stop you before you get in there.
Can I say something else, Ivo? I mean, I think it's really different if you've got a Pedro Sanchez going to talk to Xi, or if you've got Olaf Scholz going to talk to Xi, or even if you have Macron going to talk to Xi about Ukraine. When you have Lula goes and talks to Xi, and then the first thing he says on his way out the door is that the European Union should stop encouraging war. I think that's a very different thing. I mean, I think that he totally bought it hook, line, and sinker. So I think you're right that the Chinese potentially have leverage there, but I think Lula totally bought it.
Yeah,
well, sorry, go ahead.
So let me add to that because you said something that I thought was interesting. Objectively speaking, I think you're absolutely right that Xi is the only one who has the theoretical capacity to influence Putin. But you also said that you thought he was actually doing that in a positive way towards the end of the war. Did I hear that right? And if so, how do you see that?
What did I mean? Yeah, well, he's been very clear about don't use nuclear weapons.
Yep.
They have not, he's been very clear, and his officials been very clear. Now, maybe they're lying, but they are not supplying military weapons to Russia. Russia wants them. The Wagner Group asked for them. China said no. So that's really important. If it's a war of attrition, it's okay to me. I mean, maybe it's not okay if you get little chips that go through Azerbaijan or Armenia, that Russians, you can't seal the borders. But if China were to actually supply Russia, the war would change radically. So I think in this sense, it's a restraint. It's a real legitimate restraint. And also the Chinese keep insisting, and that they recognize Ukraine as a sovereign country within its international borders. They do not recognize the annexation of Crimea. They do not recognize the annexation of 4 parts of the Donbass. Now, I'm not defending China here.
No, I think your point is well taken.
But just to extend it for one more second, because this was really the point of your question and of Carla's very good comment, which is, yes, the world is shifting and the West is getting smaller and the West is getting poorer by comparison. Still quite rich, I'd have to say. But we are going to have to figure out a way to deal with a China that has its own interests in the world that are not necessarily our interests, and where you have a China who's so rich it can bail out African countries in ways the IMF and World Bank aren't doing. Now, maybe it's not to their benefit, but that's what's happening. They're using their currency now for more oil purchases. They're going to get a lot of good raw material from Russia. They're doing military exercises. The world is shifting, and we should think about why it's shifting, how it's shifting, and just stop whining about it, which is what we seem to be doing most of the time.
We whine, but what we do is we unpack the whining.
Exactly.
Prashant,
exactly.
Either of the two, both the question of actually China's role in trying to fashion or influence the course of the war in Ukraine, if you want to pick that up. But also, secondly, this larger point about the shifting world, China's role in it. Janet Yellen had yesterday, I think, a very important speech that people need to pay attention to, because it's the largest statement by the most senior U.S. official since Tony Blinken's speech on U.S.-China economic relations, it could have been written by any European leader, as far as I can tell, in the same way. But that I take either or both those points.
Yeah, I think I think one of the difficulties here is sort of making categorical statements in any way, because China is such a behemoth and it has so many interests. It's like saying the United States is pro this or anti that. It's so big that making these kinds of blanket statements is, I think, quite difficult. And that is where I think the United States itself gets into a little measure of difficulty, because, for example, the Democracy Summit, I think, has been reasonably critiqued as, there are natural American allies like Vietnam. And, it's standoff with China, who are not democracies, that the United States should continue to court, because if it believes that, the China is its sort of pacing challenge, as DOD calls it, then, Vietnam is a natural ally. I think when you think about China in the context of the war, one of the things that I think about a lot is, what are China's interests here? And China, in a lot of ways, has a difficult balance, because as Steve, I think, rightly points out, it has shown restraint in terms of supporting Russia. But at the same time, it doesn't really have an incentive structure to go against Russia, because, what is Biden suddenly going to lift the chip restrictions? Is he not going to announce investment restrictions at the G7 in May, which they sound like they're going to do? All of those things were happening independent of the war to some degree, or have been happening independent of the war. So what does Xi Jinping gain by telling Russia to stop, or to suddenly sort of taking a harder line against Russia? I just don't see what the upside is, because all of these restrictions that have been coming have not been because of Chinese support for Russia. I mean, however we define it, limited, restrained, they've been coming because of American standoff with China. And so this is actually quite a useful thing. I mean, I think it's been well reported that this has now been depleting NATO stocks, American stocks. And so, depending on your view of how imminent or reasonable a potential unification with Taiwan is, that certainly is to China's advantage. I mean, I feel like China is, as Steve, I think, rightly points out, playing its interests. To call it sort of, to moralize about it, I think is a dangerous kind of way that, China should be in support of this or shouldn't be in support of that. I mean, it's a country with interests. The United States often supports non-democratic regimes because it's in its interests, and China is simply doing the same. I think, once we think of it in that way, it changes our perception of them. That's how I've been viewing it, to some degree at least.
Ivo, you raised the Janet Yellen speech, and I think this goes to Prashant's point, which is and I could be wrong, but the Yellen speech, I think they're backing things down a little bit. And the trade rep, who is really a hardliner on China, went out of her way to say that she's not arguing for, quote, decoupling as well. I think that this is coordinated. I think it's going to take a lot for them to put this back in the box, particularly because of these, October squeeze on advanced chips, and they've got to make some sort of a decision. I think they went really far out on a limb, and Tony Blinken's notion that somehow we can compete in certain areas with them, we can squeeze them to death in certain other areas, but at the same time we'll work with them in climate and try to avoid going to war on Taiwan. I think they went too far. I think things were getting out of control there. At the same time, I think the Chinese also, as Prashant said, I think they're complex. I think Xi has been going around patting himself on the back and enjoying this enormously. But China's central bank governor met with Jay Powell on the sidelines of the World Bank and the IMF meeting. I think they too see that maybe they don't want to live in a world completely without the United States. So, this is a complicated thing.
Yeah, no,
I think the difficulty with this is just separating the rhetoric from the action. This is what I struggle with, at least on a regular basis. Is I think the Yellen speech is a really important speech, but I just don't see American policy against China changing. I mean, the sort of atmosphere may be more positive, but again, they've still gotten the Netherlands and Japan to effectively ban chip making exports to China. This is not just the U.S. policy, but the U.S. has been courting an array of allies on a lot of these kind of policies, and so. The Yellen speech, I've been struggling in terms of how important is it really? Is it just sort of, a cabinet member, a senior cabinet member saying something, or is it actual change of policy? And it seems to be the former rather than the latter, at least so far.
Well, I think it's also, if I can say, a real gesture to the European Union, which has really been very vocal against this idea of decoupling. Ursula von der Leyen gave quite a good speech. Now, who does Ursula von der Leyen really speak for? But it was, very impressive speech in which she made exactly this point. We are not interested in decoupling. We are interested in de-risking in certain key areas. And I think the Americans heard that too. Now, how much, Janet Yellen pays attention to Ursula von der Leyen, I'm not sure. But I think you're all right. It's a bit of a step back.
So
of rhetoric.
I'm going to put a slightly different gloss on it. I actually think, it's not a step back. It's just an explanation of where they've been all along. And I think there's been a tendency to presume that the Biden administration's policy on economic matters is the same as the Trump's policy because they kept the tariffs in. But in fact, the economic interaction between the United States and China, which reached a high point last year, continues. And any economist or anybody who will tell you anything is the idea that you can actually decouple the U.S. economy from the Chinese economy or the Chinese economy from the global economy is nonsense. And the problem is that they have never said that. But, I've been talking to people inside the administration, been saying this all along, that what we are focused on is those particular areas that have a direct national security interest and, a competitive edge in the future global economy. And who started that? It was the Chinese. Remember, the Chinese had planned 2025 10 years ago that said that we need to be the world leaders in AI, in supercomputing, in quantum computing, in robotics, and in synthetic biofuels. And we are going to make sure that the way we do that is to steal as much as we can from IP and other things from other people and to invest in our own capacity. So there is a race and there is a competition that, frankly, I think the Biden administration tried to take on. But they got caught in this, you want to decouple, when in fact, I think the right language, and you now hear Americans saying it, is de-risking, which Olaf Scholz put on the table first in his big piece he did prior to going to China. And of course, it was the same language as von der Leyen had in her speech I now hear people in Washington talking about de-risking, because that's a different notion. It's about supply chain vulnerabilities that were exposed in COVID, national security things. But the idea that we don't want American companies, that the U.S. government doesn't want American companies to be there. Apple can't leave. You can't have an iPhone, a Mac, an Apple Watch, or any other product from Apple without the Chinese manufacturing capacity. And people understand that.
But I think, Ivo, just to push back on this a little bit, I mean, if you just sort of take what you just sort of said, I mean, you're effectively saying that Apple should continue to build iPhones in China, but China should not have access to the advanced semiconductors that go into those iPhones. So effectively, Apple should just be using it as a low-quality manufacturing base. And the United States is fairly explicitly saying we do not want China to become an advanced technological economy. Now, they're using, whether we agree or disagree, I think the sort of argument is, semiconductors are core to manufacturing, sort of military manufacturing capability, and that's why it's a national security risk. But, frankly, the other thing is, they're saying, you cannot have a 5 nanometer chip, a 4 nanometer chip in China. And so effectively no advanced technology will ever come out of China.
So I think what they're saying is you can have it, but you shouldn't be able to do it with Western technology. And because there is a race going on in terms of who is going to, there's an AI race going on, who is going to be, the leader in that. So, but that's competition, and the way to compete, so it is different than the globalization framework, which is if everybody has access to everything else, the most, there will be winners and losers. This is it is protectionist. Right. It is trying to deglobalize part of the economy, but it's not complete. It's not total. It's not, let's have two different systems. And yet that is how the Chinese portray it. And in some ways is how the Chinese are acting.
I don't know. I'm in Prashant's camp. I mean, to me, this October, cutoff of chips. I mean, to me, I see this as it's very easy to be read on the Chinese part as an act of economic warfare.
Yeah, I can see that why, but so could the 2025 plan on the part of the Chinese 10 years ago. And so we are in a different world.
There's certainly a competition going on, and that's better than war, but we may get there too.
Yeah, and I think the larger point that we would all agree with is that this competition not lead to confrontation, and that in order to do that, you need to have conversation and talk and be able to engage. And of course, again, that's where the Chinese are saying, we're not interested in talking right now. Big piece in the good piece today in the New York Times, in your paper, Steve, on that. Let's switch, because there's one place where people love to talk. In fact, NATO used to stand for no action, talk only. That was before my time, by the way.
Yes, of course.
And maybe after my time, but it wasn't when I was there. Anyway, Steve, you wrote a piece in the Times about NATO Reborn. We talked about it during the piece, but you also talked to a lot of other people. Talk a little bit about two things. One, that sort of what were you seeing that is important for people to know. But secondly, today, and I guess it may already be over, the defense ministers were meeting in Germany once again to see how they can help Ukraine. And the NATO Secretary General was in Ukraine yesterday, in which he said that Ukraine belongs in NATO. That's a week after the Secretary of State of the United States said that we're not so fast. So help us unpack where we are.
I think the general notion is not so fast, but let's see what happens in the war. It's not just the Americans, it's the Germans, it's the French. Most of NATO says not so fast, right? Look, what's going on in NATO, in a way, it's obvious, but in a way, there's a lot going on under the blanket. And it's something they're quite sensitive about. But I would say that it wasn't the annexation of Crimea, but it was Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, the shock of the brutality of Russian occupation, as if Chechnya had never happened and Budyonnost never happened. Suddenly we woke up because this was somehow Europe, right? And not just Russia itself. And we said, oh, these are horrible people, and this is a horrible occupation. So we want to ensure that NATO is not going to get touched. We want to enhance our deterrence. And how do you enhance your deterrence? Partly you do it very publicly by putting more troops on the border. After 2014, NATO, as you know, put 4 battalion-sized, fairly small, rotating troops in the 3 Baltic states and Poland, led by bigger nations, but carefully, not to get Russia too upset. But after this invasion in last February, those 4 became 8, basically all along the border with Russia. Finland came into NATO, Sweden will come in, and NATO is working how to make those battalion size. All 8 are only 10,000 troops total, right? Into brigade size forces, which are 4,000 to 5,000 in each country. And some of them there permanently. I mean, there's a debate about how to get there and how permanent they'll be. But the fact of the matter is, the idea is these countries do not want a month of Russian occupation before the Americans come in to save the day. So NATO's whole idea of what they call deterrence has changed. It's become much more forward-based, much more forward-leaning. Now, there are lots of problems. You know, nobody has air defense missiles. We just didn't think we needed them. So the Ukrainians are short of them. Everybody's short of them, right? The mobility problem is real. How do you get countries to go where they're supposed to go, when they're supposed to get there, with what? NATO is now working on a kind of war plans it didn't have after the Cold War ended, which is to make sure countries know exactly what's expected of them, what equipment they're supposed to have, where they're supposed to go, how quickly, who will come to support them. I mean, this is actually planning to fight a war. NATO hasn't been doing that for 30 years. Not really. So this is a big deal, and it's very expensive, and there are things people are fighting about. And part of what they're fighting about is what to say to Ukraine in NATO's big summit meeting this mid-July. And that's why Stoltenberg went to Kiev, because they invited Zelensky. But Zelensky said, unless I get some really substantive offer, I'm not coming. So I think what Jens was doing was to go to Kiev and talk to Zelensky about what would be good enough to get him to come. Zelensky says he'll come if the situation warrants it, which means I think he will come. But what kind of political guarantee, security guarantee NATO's able to give in Vilnius really is up in the air. People are fighting about it quite a lot. And they're also fighting about what kind of defense spending minimum to agree upon. 10 years ago, again, after Crimea and the Wales summit, they agreed on a goal of 2% of GDP by 2024. If you count Finland, only 8 of the 31 members have reached that figure. And of course, inside NATO, that figure is actually divided into 9 different categories, which are too complicated to talk about, even if I did understand them. So there's a long way to go. And so I think in Vilnius, they're going to say, well, 2% is really now the floor, but it's going to be very hard. Now, given that Russia's weakened, you know, maybe they can get away with spending a bit less, but for the next decade or so, it's going to be very expensive, and there's a lot to do. And I must say, I was impressed digging into NATO, which can have a PR system that's incredibly boring and anodyne, but underneath, there really is serious work going on, which encouraged me, I have to say.
Yeah, a lot of muscle memory being, as I put it, being reborn, but it takes a long time. And you know, there are a lot of people in NATO who came of age in the post-Cold War period by definition, and so they don't even know how the system works because the system hasn't been used for 30 years. Although the system exists, we did it for 40 years in NATO during the Cold War. also with the same kinds of problems that I think we will see. But there's this sense. I mean, Carla, yesterday I'm in a conference here in Washington, debate. Since the Russian army has been completely devastated, it doesn't exist anymore as a true fighting force. It may be there as a good defensive force, but not as a fighting force. And it will take a decade plus of modernization. Is the question: okay, is NATO coming to this too late when it comes to Russia because they probably should have done it earlier, and now it's no longer necessary, or does this show the world is just a very dangerous place? You need to be much more ready. You have to have ammunition stocks in the millions rather than in the tens of thousands, whether it's air defense missiles, as Steve said, or artillery shells, or bullets for rifles. What do you think the lesson is, and where do you think we ought to be going in this?
Well, even before, as the Russians were perched on the border of Ukraine, there was this debate in Washington, as you know, Ivo, very well, the people who were saying, why do Ukraine when the real fight is going to be Taiwan, China? And we're going to expend all these resources that we need to be husbanding and actually growing to get ready for the real fight, the real show. And there are other people who are pushing back and saying, this is Europe. And if anything, weakening Russia means that we'll be able to focus more on Asia after this war is over with. I think that what the genesis of this is going to be is a weak Russia, paper tiger Russia. Can we say this, or is it a paper bear? That we're going to have to focus more. Yes, we're going to have to do all the things. The defense industrial base is weak. We're going to have to invest a lot more in it, but we're going to have to invest a lot more in it so we can focus on Asia. And yes, we have to build up NATO, because NATO is going to have to take responsibility for Europe, because we, after this is over with, are going to have to focus on Asia.
Yeah, I think that's part of the debate that's going on here in Washington as well. But it means, in effect, you need to do this no matter what the paper bear looked at.
Ivo, just one other thing is you know what this is like. Is that everybody in the different services are always looking for a justification for how they spend their money. But I gave a talk at one of the war colleges the other day, and all but one of the questions that I got was about Asia. Only one question was about Ukraine.
Yeah, no, and then if you were in the war college today, that's what you're going to be looking at. The Great Pacific War, as somebody called it the other day, that's coming up. Prashant, from your perch in London and actually global perch that you look at it, do you see this debate as the right kinds of argument? Or is it it's the Europe versus Asia piece, but it's also what's interesting. That's Europe versus Asia, but what about the rest of the world? I mean, to bring in the sort of the conversations that we had with Brazil and others who were saying, well, wait a minute, one is over militarized, and two, in this discussion, which is traditional for American foreign policy, but two, there's a lot happening in the rest of the world that matters and you ought to be paying attention to.
I think the answer to that multiple choice question is yes. I just, how do we possibly, it's just such a, I have a lot of sympathy for the people who have to prioritize between these various things, because it's a difficult one. I mean, the kind of person who comes out with saying that we should prioritize Asia, we should prioritize Europe, I think the United States is sort of defining belief is it can do both. And that's where I think this idea has really, to some degree, that's, I think, what one of the struggles in DC is, can the United States do both? Does it have the weapon stockpiles to, supply Ukraine while being sufficiently prepared for a potential naval battle over Taiwan? And at the moment, at least, it seems like the answer is no. But that doesn't mean that the answer is perpetually no and will be no in the future. It could be a sort of galvanizing debate. I do think, though, you're right to say that this question links very clearly to discussions that are happening elsewhere in the world. I think, a year ago, I do think Washington is moderated to some degree in this conversation. A year ago, if you were to ask, I think, most mainstream DC types about what they think about India's stance over Ukraine, they would have been much more hawkish than they are today. Because I think, DC has done an admirable job of, or, at least a job of understanding why India behaves the way it does when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. And so has Europe. And understood that, India, as a sovereign state, has its own interests and has to be courted and won over, and has things that it wants done that may not be necessarily aligned. And so this is where I think the difficulty will come in. It goes, this is, I think, been the essential conversation of these 45 minutes we've been talking is, this understanding that it's not a with us or against us kind of question, and particularly over Europe. Whenever I go and talk to my relatives in India or Singapore, Ukraine doesn't come up very often. It just doesn't, because it's a European war to them. Whether or not there are greater sort of ideas at stake of liberalism and freedom, just in terms of narrow self-interest, it's just not in the core.
Yeah, it's just not the way that the United States tends to think about these issues. But, India will be with you on something. Others, it's a member of the Quad. It may not be with you on this particular. It's that nuance that is necessary in the increasingly complicated world. And we've seen in the past 45 minutes in a terrific discussion how complicated that world is. It's not getting any better from the really tragic events that are happening in Sudan, all the way through to what's happening in Ukraine and the relationship between big powers. An excellent conversation. I want to thank Carla Robbins, Steve Erlanger, Prashant Rao for being with us this week. We'll be back next week with another edition of World News. And until then, have a wonderful weekend.